Hey, everybody. So it looks like we're live now. I am here with the incredible Josh Seiter or Seiter. How do you say your last name?
Cider.
Seiter. I love that. Where's your last name from?
It's German. So my dad's German, and then my mom's Jewish. So it's an
I had
interesting.
a feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. It's great to have you on. We both have had our experiences with the trans cult, albeit different ones. But I kind of want to get your insight on some of that. So, for those who don't know, Josh conducted what he calls a social experiment for 5 months, in which he, as per his wording, faked being a faker. So he pretended to be trans. And his stepping out onto the trans scene was kind of controversial because, of course, there were some people who were saying this guy is faking it. This guy's a grifter. He's faking it. And then there were other people who perhaps genuinely bought into it. And there were probably like kind of layers of skepticism. So I guess, Josh, I've seen some interviews of yours, and I kind of want to ask maybe some questions that maybe didn't get asked in previous interviews. And I guess the first question I have for you is really like, you know, what motivated you, as you say, to pretend to be a pretender?
Yeah. Well, exactly that. The fact that I was seeing this entire movement of people cosplaying, being something they're not, and appropriating women's identities for themselves. I watched all of this and then watched the media and politicians cheer it on and making disingenuous statements that, trans women are valid. And, I knew a little bit about the science. I have a law degree and, got my bachelor's in political science and sociology. So we studied the intersectionalities of gender and socioeconomic status. So, just as having that educational background, plus just being a common sense guy, said, you know what? All of this is false. It's not true that just because a man has gender dysphoria, he doesn't magically sprout wings and become a woman. This is ludicrous. And I said, I want to call it out. And my friend said, well, Josh, if you call it out, they're just going to say you're a transphobe and a bigot and you'll get canceled. And I said, well, I could call it out by becoming one of them, exposing how ridiculous they act, and then from the inside out, kind of like a cancerous mole, I destroy the movement by showing, how ludicrous it is. That a man can just throw on lipstick and a dress and magically become a woman. And so I did the experiment exactly how I planned it, and I think that it was a powerful reminder that at the end of the day, all of us biological men are just playing dress up. We're just cosplaying being real women, and we are always going to be men because our sex doesn't change.
Yeah, I think it's really brilliant the way you describe like gender ideology as kind of a cancerous virus. I also liken it to that because it's from my experience, and I started trans identifying when I was 12, and I was in the trans cult for 12 years. So that was half of my life, by the time I got out. And for those who don't know, it was really surviving like multiple wars and Hamas terrorists that really sort of shook me out of this like first world delusional luxury belief system. And the way that I see it kind of shifting, like, in a very veridic and cancerous way, is that essentially you start with a bunch of false premises, like premises that are false, and they're also like they're totally unprovable, like the idea of gender identity. Like you can't find it in the brain, and none of the treatments are aimed at cutting the gender identity out of the brain. It's just aimed at cutting into the body to align the body with the gender identity that we can't even prove exists. And so and it's sort of it's very veridic. It latches on to all of these other sort of woke postmodernist ideas. And but to get out of the philosophy, because we could stay here forever, I guess I was wondering, sort of like, you know during your social experiment, did you have a ton of contact with any trans communities, like in real life?
No, I live a pretty just, cis male lifestyle. So I wasn't like going to the gay clubs or infiltrating societies of trans women. I, just lived my life how I normally do. But whenever I went out in very public places and whenever I was filming, I was, in costume as they are. And so no, I didn't do any like very, very deep dive into them. Other than months prior to this experiment, I started laying the groundwork in sowing the seeds of this by making statements like, oh, I'm bisexual, I'm pansexual, and the media picked up these statements and claims and spread stories about it. And I thought that would be a good way to give myself credibility when I decided to do the trans experiment. So it was a very long process where I slowly laid the groundwork for it so that it could actually work.
Oh, that's actually really interesting that you sort of planned it ahead of time. I mean, so is it? Let's set the record straight. Are you bisexual? Are you pansexual? What are you, Josh?
No, I'm just just like all the trans women out there, I'm just a dude. So, yep, I'm just a bio male, just like all of them. But unlike them, I am straight. I'm totally straight. And those were just little planted stories to kind of insinuate myself into this narrative down the road.
And do you think that it was effective did it give you more credibility to first say that you were bisexual? Like, did that work out in practice?
Yeah, because with the alphabet mafia, they like overtures and they like people to kind of genuflect and kneel before them. And so, extending an olive branch by saying I'm bisexual or saying I'm pan or saying, ooh, it's Pride Month, I support it. I did little things like that because they're just so gullible and they love to believe anything that anyone says that I thought that would be a good strategy and they bought it. Because they don't question anything. So,
yeah, I started to notice that when I was writing that thread about you. I was noticing, I was looking in the Advocate and in Pink News and all these different sources to see how they were reporting on you. First, based on your sort of claimed bisexuality, and then the trans identity, and then the sort of reveal of, oh, this was all a big charade. And it was really interesting how quickly they started referring to you with female pronouns. Like, I just remember looking at that and being shocked. Like, I wonder, what kind of cognitive dissonance is occurring in those people's minds. Like, do they genuinely believe that, you can't tell somebody's quote unquote gender or their sex by looking at them? Like, I just kind of wonder, like, to what extent do the writers of all of those columns actually believe the kind of the content they're putting out? Do you have any idea of, like, are they doing this because there's just this forced ideological coherence or like compliance, or do you think that some people may have genuinely believed that you were just maybe like a trans woman in an early stage of transition?
yeah, that's a great question. People start policing themselves when they see that there are negative consequences for certain actions. And I think something that the Democrats and the left and the woke mob have been great at over the decades, at least since the 90s, is, making sure there's harsh consequences for people that don't talk the way they want them to talk and believe the things they want them to believe. And what we end up doing as a society is we self-censor and self-police ourselves. And so I think a lot of journalists are doing that. They're policing themselves. They don't want to get canceled for being transphobic by giving Josh Seiter the wrong pronouns. So, hey, I have a choice here. I can either say he, her, he, him, or she, her. Well, I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose my peer group. I don't want to get sued. I don't want to, be called a bigot. So I'm just going to refer to Josh as a she. So I think there's a lot of self-imposed pressure that is a result of the ideologies that the liberals have built up, and then the assistance of the media, which likes to go after and try to punish anyone who doesn't play this kind of sick game of Simon Says, where you have to parrot what the official narrative is.
Yeah, no, I think your conclusion there, or your insight, is very apt, and I think that perhaps it's because you've had quite a few encounters with the media. I mean, I heard that you were on the Bachelorette, which is a show I haven't watched. I'm not like super into reality TV, or just fiction in general. I'm more of like ever since I was like a little kid, I just preferred like parenting books and medical journals. And it seems like, so from my basic understanding of who you are, like, you have had quite a bit of contact with the media. Are there any general trends that you've noticed in the way that you were reported about back in 2015, I believe it was, when you were on that show, as compared to today? Like, are there any, like, I guess, do you have any insight into how the media how different media platforms maybe spin stories or anything. You have a smile on your face. I can tell you have something to say.
Well, there's really only one thing I can speak to when it comes to this. I wish I could offer you a great answer that answered all your questions, but I really don't have any magical insight into how the media operates. But one thing I noticed is when I was doing the experiment, there was a number of journalists that I was in contact with from, one was from People magazine and one was from the LA Times. And both of them said explicitly, I'm following your journey on Instagram, and I would love to write about what's going on. Your page is taking off, but this is considered an extremely sensitive topic, and it's something we don't want to go near, because if we say the wrong thing, then, basically we could lose our jobs or it wouldn't be good. And so this is two journalists, People magazine, LA Times, telling me the exact same thing, that they'd love to write on this, but they just can't, because if they say the wrong thing, they'll get canceled. And I think that just kind of shows you how far woke culture has gone, that, there's no more free speech now. We're self-policing ourselves.
Yeah, and I've been trying to figure out, like, when it comes to gender ideology, there are so many different crises that are wrapped up in it. Like there's the sort of men and women's sports, men and women's spaces. You have the medicalization of children and of, vulnerable adults without any evidence to suggest that this is a good idea. You have the cancellation of women. You have the hijacking of gay rights organizations, and you have the law sort of rewriting definitions around something that is so basic and so fundamental and like so fundamentally immutable about who we are. And I wonder what your thoughts are on this, because in my mind, a lot of people would like to claim that this is all a big conspiracy, like some big depopulation conspiracy. Perhaps I'm young and naive, and perhaps the bow tie is cutting off oxygen to my brain, but I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think that this entire crisis of gender ideology and the way that it has hijacked Western institutions one by one actually is a result of a lot of different kind of variables and factors that are all coming together to create this perfect storm. Like clearly in my mind, our institutions are, especially American institutions, that really sort of excelled the spread of this ideology and pushed it to the rest of the world, when it could have just stayed a niche medical experiment in Europe, and I see some fundamental vulnerabilities within American institutions that I believe we need to thoroughly diagnose if we want to sort of root this ideology out of our institutions. But I guess my question to you is, based on you have like this background in political science. I also have a degree in political science, and you also have this sociology degree. And I was wondering if you had any insights on the current kind of cultural moment or the hijacking of Western institutions. And, do you have any insight as to how we've gotten here? Because you're a couple decades, I think, older than I am. So you might have sort of seen this topic evolve for longer than I have. I just want to hear like what your thoughts are on any of those.
Yeah, great question. It has gone through a lot of permutations over the decades. I remember it was 1993. I was 6 years old, and my mom and dad were telling us that they were homeschooling all of us. They yanked my two brothers out of school and homeschooled all of us, because at that time my brothers were being sent home with books that were like Why Timmy Has Two Daddies, just weird books that were about sexual orientation that were wholly inappropriate for kids that age. They're in elementary school. And so my dad warned back then that this was a problem. He's like, these people have an agenda. They're not going to stop until they, carry it out. And it's starting now as, we just want equal rights. But what we're seeing is they're trying to push this stuff in the schools, and it's not okay. And so that was, in 1993. So since then, it's only gotten worse, exactly how my father predicted. And so now doesn't just suffice to, teach about it in a sex ed class. Now you have to have Drag Story Hour. Now you have to have a pride flag in every classroom. You have to celebrate Pride Month. It just keeps growing and growing and metastasizing. And as you said, it seems almost like all these institutions, the politicians, the media, the intelligentsia on the left, have all kind of coalesced together around this ideology that should have been discredited a long time ago, and they're propagating it for some reason. And the question is why? Now, to get to your question, I would argue, at least for politicians, the reason they're incentivized to go along with this is because the more they pander to a group, the more votes they'll get. So, they're going to let a bunch of people into our country so that they can get them signed up to vote for them. They're going to tell Black people that all of their problems are because of racism, so Black people vote for them. And then with this group of people that is actually fairly large with the LGBTQ community, they'll say anything to indulge them so they can get this huge voting block. And so it's not surprising that they go along with whatever ridiculous agenda they come up with. I mean, you think of Kamala Harris. Anytime someone's talking to her about something, she just nods her head and is like, yeah, we should do that. Even when a guy suggested Blacks should have different laws than whites, she said, oh, yeah, great idea. So I think they're in it for the votes. Why the media perpetuates this, I think, is just because they're all private institutions that are publicly traded. All they care about is views. They don't care about objectivity or the truth. And so they're incentivized from a money standpoint to create rage bait titles that get the public fired up. So what will more enrage people than talk about a man in a bikini going into a school to do a drag performance? I mean, that's really going to get people pissed off and tuning in. And they're glad because they don't have to settle the issue or get to the truth of the issue. As long as they're getting clicks, they're making a profit and their shareholders are happy. So that's why the media propagates this stuff. I really don't understand why higher education does. That's more of a shock to me because these are the people that are supposed to, be the intelligentsia and the, safeguard our cerebral faculties. They're in charge of educating our children. And why would they buy something like this? So ridiculous. It says that a biological man is a valid woman because he has a gender identity that differs from his assigned sex. And I can't answer that question. I don't know why our higher institutions are going along with it, but I think they're destroying the country by doing it.
Yeah, and I would even go so far as to say that American higher ed institutions that are propagating these lies are not just destroying the United States, they're really destroying the entire West. They're taking down like the entirety of Western civilization. And I think that I have a basic idea, I think, as to why people who are very cerebral latch onto these ideas, because I was a very cerebral child, at the age of 12, when I found the concept of the female to male sex changes at the age of 12. I found it in a medical journal, not on social media, but in a medical journal. And it's like, what kind of 12-year-old reads medical journals? Like probably the ones who are like very curious and have a more intellectual bent to their personality. And I think that, people who are highly intelligent have this sort of desire to like, once they latch onto something emotionally because they feel like it might meet some kind of emotional need, they will find every way to rationalize it. And because they're very like logical and they're good at building internally cohesive arguments, they will logic themselves into this storm where, from each logical premise, they'll build an argument. And the logical premises are false, but you can still make a logically like coherent argument on false premises. You just get to a conclusion that is like obviously false. And I think that the if you think about like philosophy students, what they do in their free time is like they'll smoke marijuana and just kind of philosophize at 3 a.m. about random topics. Like that's what they do for fun. Like we're talking about nerds here, And so I think that when it comes to that type of person, it makes sense when you have these kind of really sort of obsessive intellectuals that like they like to chew on new ideas. Like new ideas are very tantalizing. And then you have like, if you're able to convince somebody successfully enough of your argument, then you publish a piece of work on it, and then you're just referenced a bunch of times. Then there's this like alleged, body of literature that's just a bunch of like fallacious pieces stacked on top of each other and kind of positioned as if it's like some kind of legitimate sort of academic pursuit. And I just think that, it's the nature of the claims of gender ideology that require this much censorship, because of course, nobody's going to believe that a man can become a woman unless they are like literally forced to believe it. Like very few people will actually believe that. And I think that's why, all these institutions are sort of requiring people to collude with these false ideas because they can't stand on their own. Wokeness can't stand if it remains, if it's allowed to be refuted. It can only stand when it is allowed to remain unrefuted. And so I guess, like, since we're, coming up on, we have like 5 minutes left or so, I guess I have a list of questions. Let's see. I guess I want to know what was your first encounter with a trans topic, like, if you can remember, and how did that shift with time to the point where you decided, okay, like, I'm going to pull the trigger on this social experiment? Like, what was the evolution of that like?
Oh, wow. I mean, I remember 15 years ago when I first moved to Chicago, seeing advertisements for drag shows and stuff, and even just out and about, I'd see, a man dressed up as a woman. Not all drag performers are trans, so I don't want to conflate the two erroneously, but I'd see people cross-dressing, which is what all of these people are. They're bio males that are cross-dressing, nothing more. And I was like, that is just, it's so bizarre. I mean, you realize with one glance, well, it has to be a mental illness because they look mentally ill, and they're not attractive to anyone. Anyone who says they are attractive is lying. And I was like, so that was 15 years ago. And then I kept seeing this brought up. Then I heard about Drag Story Hour like 4 years ago. And I was like, okay, this is getting ridiculous. Then kids' books talking about sex and a man having sex with a child in the different positions. We all saw the videos going viral on Instagram and Facebook. And I was like, okay, this is hitting another level. And then I just kept seeing the refrain, trans women are women, trans women are valid. And then I started to see the science, right? And the science says that to be a valid trans person, all you need is a gender identity that differs from your biological sex. You don't need to get surgery. You don't need to take hormones. You don't need to have gender dysphoria. You don't even need to present differently. So long as your gender identity differs from your bio sex, you're trans, you're valid. And I said, well, this is ridiculous. I could throw on lipstick. I don't even have to throw on lipstick. I can just say, this is my new personal identity, and suddenly I'm valid. And so I said, I want to expose how absurd this is. I'm going to use the principle of reductio ad absurdum, where I show a proposition's false by showing that when taken to its logical end, it leads to absurd results. I wanted those absurd results to be me and my obnoxious videos. And I think a lot of people got the point I was proving there, which is, hey, this stuff's ridiculous. Look what happens when you give it your imprimatur. All they are at the end of the day is men dressed up as women. And so that was kind of the evolution over 15 years of, I just kind of reached a breaking point. And I was like, someone needs to point out how ridiculous this is. And the fact that people couldn't distinguish slapstick comedy from someone being genuinely trans shows that it's a complete joke, because it's indistinguishable from comedy.
Right. And it's and whether somebody is, doing this type of social experiment or pretending to be a pretender, as you say, or whether they're genuinely trans, like, it seems like that's all. It's so hard to distinguish the pretenders from the true trans, that it makes one question if trans is a legitimate concept at all. Like, maybe in the last minute or so, I kind of want to hear, like, when you say genuinely trans and when others say genuinely trans, like, what does that even mean?
Well, I think that's a misnomer, because they're faking being women. So if you mean it's someone genuinely faking being a woman, and then Josh Seiter is someone insincerely faking a woman, it doesn't matter. There's no hierarchy in pretending. There's no hierarchy in cosplaying. We are all faking being women. Now, if you want to say that the litmus test for whether it's authentic is that you need a mental illness and you need to have a delusional belief that you're a fake woman, and that's the test, and then suddenly you're valid, then what you're saying is anyone who's rational can't be trans. And what you're saying is, by definition, trans people have to be mentally ill. And if they're mentally ill, why are we validating it when we don't validate other mentally ill beliefs like, hey, I'm an anorexic, I'm fat and obese at 70 pounds. We don't say, oh, yeah, you're right, you should starve yourself and get liposuction. We treat those people. If someone with schizophrenia were to say, I think I'm in the wrong body, they'd say, hold on, sir, you're not in the wrong body, you have schizophrenia, take these pills and talk to somebody about it. But you get out of all of that, when you say, hey, I have gender dysphoria. And it's like, oh, okay, then you're trans. No, they're just faking being a woman. That's your conclusion they're trans. You haven't provided any evidence of that. And the medical literature doesn't provide evidence of it. It just states it as a matter of fact that they are then trans and they are then valid because they have a mental illness. And I don't agree with that premise at all. So to answer your question, there is no differentiating when it comes to pretending to be women. We are all dudes pretending to be women.
Right. No, I think I think it's very important, because there's all this rhetoric and discourse around like the true trans and the fake trans. And it seems like nobody's been able to provide a definition or like a clinical or diagnostic criteria for true trans versus fake trans. Like how do you know who is a trans trender? Is a trans trender just like somebody who has like colored hair who you don't like? Like, I mean, it seems as if, I mean, if we're going to pretend that there are any scientific pretenses for any of this, then maybe we should try to explore, and maybe this is the direction that the culture war won't take, but that science should take, which is really getting back to the roots of like, why is it that we have these different cohorts who are presenting with this sex distress, and or people who are extremely non-conforming? Like, we need to sort of figure out, we know that there are different etiologies for males and females. We know there are different cohorts. And I just think that, instead of dismissing the entire concept, we need to try to figure out, like, why is it that there are people who want to engage in these radical body modifications? And what can we do to non-invasively help them through their distress so that we don't have to like rearrange society in order to, reify these false metaphysical claims. So that's just kind of my take. And
yeah, we can go for like another 5 minutes. I was just
cool.
going to add to that.
Yeah, please.
There's no the last part you said about the medical backing of it, it just isn't there, and they've reverse engineered everything, and then, as you said, provide ex post justifications for it. So, we want to conclude that men that have gender dysphoria are women. So let's go and rearrange all the definitions, all the meaning of words, all the science, and then we can arrive at the conclusion that we want, and then we'll reference that stuff to support it. Well, they reverse engineered all of that, and so now it's very easy to support a false premise. And so I think that was very important that you pointed that out. And there's no lengths they're not willing to go to justify it. They'll, not all women have uteruses. They'll say not all women have vaginas. Your chromosomes don't dictate your gender. I mean, whatever they have to destroy and erase and change to get to agree with that premise that they came up with, they'll do. And I think we see that. They get very frantic whenever there's free discussion and open dialogue about this issue, because they know people with two brain cells will go, this is all bullshit. The science is nebulous. It's a patchwork of meaningless terms that allow anybody to claim they're trans and a woman. And so I think it's leading to a lot of pushback and a lot of blowback. And it's reaching absurd levels where you even have Kamala Harris bragging about how she paved the way in California for men to get self-mutilate themselves at the expense of the taxpayer. Now they're being thrown into, these are mostly violent men. Male patterns of violence don't change just because you're trans. And these men are now being put into prisons with women who have committed nonviolent offenses, and they're raping and impregnating them, which Redux has done a number of good studies showing, and you can go there for anyone who wants the data. And so I think it's just reaching absurd levels, and there's going to be a lot of pushback with it, and then people like me and you who are having discussions about it. Yeah,
I do often wonder what it's going to take to root this ideology out of all of our institutions, because it wasn't like a super linear progression. I mean, if you think about this gender medicine stuff, it was like a niche medical experiment in Europe. And then post World War II, it moved its basis from like Germany to the Netherlands. These sex change procedures for men used to be done in two parts because of the medical ethics quandaries between the United States and Europe. And it was really, because of some American and like American as in from the United States, but also North American as in Canadian as well, researchers who wanted to like export this entire, field of medicine. And it was the demand, it wasn't like the demand per se that created the supply. I mean, it initially started that way, but then it was like the supply that created the demand. And it's this really odd, like cyclical sort of madness in my mind.
All things kind of start with a base need, and usually the need's small, and then there becomes so much of the supply that they have to groom or convert more people. And so whether that's big toothpaste companies that have to advertise constantly because they want you to use their toothpaste, or it's trans ideology trying to convert people because at the end of the day, there's not a lot of people that need this stuff or think about this stuff. And so these places that profit off of it, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry or the medical community or politicians, they need to keep creating people who need this stuff so they can justify what they're doing. And so I think in this case, as you pointed out, supply is now creating the demand, and it becomes this incestuous, cyclical, unhealthy, toxic relationship. And I think there's, I just saw a report on a softball team in high school in California. 15 of the 25 members of the team identify as trans. I mean, come on. It's not even statistically probable that you'd have two people in the same room that are trans. 15 of the 25 are trans. That right there is proof that a lot of this is man-made and nurture and not nature.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look to societies that don't rationalize sex-based distress and just general sort of, especially in the phases of adolescence, discomfort as, through the framework of the wrong body theory, of the trans theory, you see that it is like Andrew Gold talks about this, how in certain tribes in like Central and South America, these teenage girls describe many of the same symptoms. And yet instead of gender dysphoria, they're told that they have like some kind of demon inside of them. And so it's like there are like objectively types of sort of sex-based distress in males and females for different reasons. And it seems like it's the society that sort of tells people, how to rationalize and understand that. And so from the moment that, you have this funnel of trans, and it's an increasingly wide funnel where more and more people at younger and younger ages can get sucked into it. And from the moment that you get sucked into the funnel, it kind of closes in to the point where it's basically impossible to get out of. And so like, I just think it feels like a big trap, in my mind. And yeah, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you need to go, just like, let me know,
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. And we always try to capitalize on things because we're a capitalist society and we want to privatize and profit off of something. And I would say that the trans community and trans ideology has been privatized and commodified so that they can make money off of it. And they're ruthless. And I think they've gotten the media involved. They've gotten politicians involved. And I think the pharmaceutical lobbies and the medical lobbies all are incentivized to want to keep having people in distress. If they don't have people in distress, they can't benefit, they can't pander, they can't get votes. And so I think it is meant to kind of not only keep people in who are already in, but it constantly needs to convert new members and get new membership. It's like a horrible Ponzi scheme. It's just, it's like they just need an influx of people constantly, and they're willing to do whatever they have to. And so even though there might be a more simpler explanation for somebody's gender distress, well, this is the way to go, because if I tell them they need to change bodies, then the pharma companies can make some money, the doctors can make some money, politicians can get some votes this year by saying they'll give them more rights. I mean, I feel like all the incentives flow the wrong way, and I feel like, as you pointed out, people are getting sucked into this, and it's because we have chosen to commodify it and to privatize it and to try to make a profit off of it. And I think it's disgusting, and I think at the end of the day, the main victims of this are trans people themselves.
Yeah, no, I would say that you're correct. I think that, we often think of like people who've been harmed by transition, and we would often, call them detransitioners or regretters. But in my mind, the harm is objective. Like the regret is a subjective reaction to the harm, but the harm of gender medicine is just, it is objectively, the damage or destruction of healthy body parts and the disruption of healthy endocrine systems. And regardless of whether or not somebody assimilates that experience as regret, the harm is objective, which is why in my mind, when we're thinking about this, like from a clinical perspective, regret is actually a really, really flimsy measurement of outcomes, because of course there's this sort of element of sunk cost fallacy where somebody is committed to a path, and especially if they've done things that either they can't come back from at all or that are very hard to come back from, then psychologically it would be absolutely catastrophic for them to admit to themselves, this was a massive mistake, I regret this. And so I think one of the final questions I want to ask you, if you have time, is really like, you were talking about this sort of massive kind of social distress that's going on, and we've discussed how it's for many people assimilated through the lens of the trans framework. I guess my question to you is, like, I have my own thoughts on this as somebody who lived through wars in the Middle East and saw the trans phenomenon play out in the United States and in Israel. But I guess my question to you is, like, why, like, you're, I'll correct the record, only like 1 decade older than me. And so you've still seen, you have like an extra, like 10 years on me. So you've seen a little bit more of this evolve. I guess I kind of want to know, like, as far as the mental health perspective, when it comes to teens and young adults, I think that within my generation and Gen Z, there's like this massive kind of influx of just mental illness. Like we've never talked more about mental health, and yet everybody is mentally ill. And so I guess I want to know, like, have you noticed shifts throughout your life with like mental illnesses, and could you maybe diagnose what those sort of cultural shifts are, if you've noticed such things?
Yeah, I think with the advent of social media, it's made things a lot worse. George Putnam wrote a book that talks about how even though media and telecommunications is supposed to bring people together, in fact, what it does in the studies it shows, it isolates people and atomizes them, and we actually become more isolated when we have communication devices, which we see all the time, people staring into a cell phone. I think that's led to a lot of feelings of depression and anxiety, existential crises, what some philosophers call an existential vacuum, where you feel like your life is meaningless and you don't have a purpose. When you fall into that existential vacuum, it's easy to cure it or remedy it by belonging to something. When you belong to a community and you're feeling isolated and you have the chance to belong to a community, it makes you feel comforted. It makes you feel like you have a sense of purpose. When you feel that way, then that existential vacuum kind of dissipates and you start making these social connections and you feel like you have a reason to get up out of bed every day and you've been imbued with this high sense of meaning. Well, that's what the trans community gives to so many people that are suffering from feelings of isolation, loneliness, and sadness. And so I think it doesn't matter what it had been. If it hadn't been the trans cult, it would have been a different cult. Because at the end of the day, it's just a cult. And when people belong to a cult, whether it's Scientology, Islam, or trans ideology, they get this sense of purpose and this sense of happiness and motivation. And so I think that's what we're seeing here, is that as technologies increased, as communication devices have increased over the last 20 years, I have seen people become more and more isolated. As that happens, they're searching more and more for a place of belonging, and in pops the trans cult. And what better thing could you belong to? They spit out t-shirts about it. There's a whole month dedicated to it. Politicians worship it. All your friends will praise you. You'll be the most woke person ever. You get all the brownie points. And you'd be an idiot not to do it, because what faces you if you don't go along with it? Derision. You get canceled. You become a pariah. And so I think for a lot of people, the trans cult just gives them that sense of belonging that they want.
Evidently didn't give you a sense of belonging, because you were in and out in 5 months.
Yeah, and it was, again, I wasn't at the highest levels. I wasn't going to Drake Story Hour with 5-year-olds. I wasn't going with bio trans men into the bathrooms like they do. I had to operate within a certain moral framework. So I didn't do those things that they do. But still, it was a very weird experience. Very odd. I said a number of times to very close friends, I see now that you would definitely have to be mentally ill to feel to do this because it's so uncomfortable. But I will say, going back to an earlier point you made, there are people that genuinely have gender distress and what is called gender dysphoria. There's no doubt. There's been cases of people that are 6 years old that are saying they're suicidal and they want to kill themselves. They can't stand the fact that they're, you know, a boy. They feel like they're a girl or vice versa. No doubt, as you said, there's people in all countries that have these gender crises. Whether the solution is religion, exorcising a demon, or joining a cult, I don't know, but we should start treating it in a more practical, pragmatic way that doesn't necessitate hacking off body parts and that doesn't provide a windfall profit to pharmaceutical companies. But there's no doubt there's people in genuine distress. They deserve our love and compassion. That's why I care so much about this issue, because they're being lost in all of this. And so I hope that the attention gets turned in the future towards treating this in a more efficacious and humane way.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that doctors need to return to the Hippocratic oath, the oath that they take to their patients to do no harm. And they need to recognize that there is no excuse for cutting into a healthy body. Like, in order to, you know, even consider this to be ethical, like they had to spin this entire fairy tale about the fact that, you know, there are these male individuals, but they have a woman's soul inside. And so it is, you know, medically ethical to cut into their healthy body if their body is causing their soul to suffer. Like, that was one of the original premises, one of the original ways that these gender doctors in the Netherlands were starting to sort of navigate these ethical quandaries, because of course in Europe they were already, you know, offering castration services to male sex offenders and to homosexual men. And so they just had to extend that logic further towards, you know, these men who really didn't want to be men. And from that moment, you know, the United States wasn't going to castrate healthy men, but once they were castrated in Europe, they could go to the United States and benefit from the post-World War II plastic surgery services of these surgeons who had operated on people who had actually lost body parts in war. And so there was this kind of ethical sort of dialectic almost that was kind of happening from the very beginning. And it just seems like you know, in order to justify such obviously unethical treatments, this movement has had to come up with so many lies. You know, they've had to say that these people are going to, you know, for the purposes of YouTube or X, you know, self-delete if they don't get these procedures. And we know that those statistics are junk statistics. We also know that these young children who present with sex dysphoria are just, like, if we're talking about the prepubertal cohort, if you just let them proceed with their natural puberty, you know, they'll just grow out of it, and most of them will become gay. And so it's pretty nuts that, like, these gay rights organizations that have been so, you know, that have allowed themselves to be so thoroughly hijacked by these, you know, by this trans rights movement, that they can't see what's right in front of them. Like, I'm sure that a lot of these men in these, like, gay rights organizations and some of these lesbians as well, like, like, do they not realize that these quote unquote trans kids are very similar to the way that they were, and that they were allowed to grow up? They were allowed to grow into themselves. They were allowed to go through their, like, a princess dress wearing phase. And a lot of them would just emerge as happy gay adults. Like, to me, it's just befuddling to consider.
Yeah, it's amazing what people will turn a blind eye to. And, you know, studies come out all the time saying that those rates of self-harm do not decrease if somebody transitions. We've all seen the studies on the unaliving themselves statistic, which does not decrease if you transition. And so there's no evidence that the treatment that's currently being offered is effective in any way. But again, they'll reverse engineer morals and ethics and medical terms any way they have to provide a justification for this conclusion they've come to, which is that these people need to transition. And so it's basically a case of don't believe your lying eyes. Hey, all you people out there that are saying this is wrong and that we're violating the Hippocratic oath, when we just don't believe your lying eyes. And even though that looks like a man, trust us, that's totally not a man. That's a woman, even though he still has his, you know, penis. It's just what they have to go through at the mental gymnastics. It's absolutely exhausting. But as you said, they've come up with a conclusion, and they just have to reverse engineer everything else. And that's why we find ourselves here today.
Absolutely. So some parting, I guess I want to get like a little, I know I've taken you way over time, but this has been great. I guess if you have like a little, maybe a couple more minutes, I want to ask you, what is your what is your parting advice to somebody who is just starting to be hit with like bricks of this, culture war content, and they're seeing all of this, trans madness, or maybe their kid gets sucked into it, maybe a family member gets sucked into it, maybe they're like forced into some kind of DEI training and work, and they're just trying to get their bearings and figure out like what in the world is going on here. I'm asked to memorize all these new terms and to say that this man is a woman. Like, do you have what do you think is most important for people who are very confused about this to understand?
Yeah, well, I always say KISS, keep it simple, stupid. If something just doesn't pass the smell test, there's a reason for it. And if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and talks like a duck, it's a duck. And the same can be said for these men. It's very obvious to anyone with two eyeballs that those are men. They're not women. They don't magically become women because they're in distress, just like a 60-pound adult doesn't magically become fat because their brain's telling them that. That image is a faulty image based on misfirings going on in their brain, and they need therapy. And the same thing with a schizophrenic person. Just because they think the CIA is hiding in their bushes, it doesn't make it true. And so the trans cult really needs to be treated the same way anyone else with a mental disorder is treated. They need cognitive behavioral therapy, they need medication. But people that feel like they're being sucked into this and they don't know, just use your common sense. And you're not alone. There's people like me and you and Buck Angel even that have been very outspoken that we're not buying it. You can't change your biosex. Your sex is immutable. And that this is a mental illness that needs to be treated and treated seriously. And so just don't be afraid to speak up, and just know you're not alone. You're not the only one that's saying this is absolutely ridiculous.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I don't want to keep you longer, any longer than you have, because I know you're quite busy. But this has been an enlightening conversation. Honestly, when I came across you doing those like trans videos in the midst of your social experiment, and then when you came on to Alex Stein and announced that the whole thing was a ruse, I was really taken aback by how well spoken you are, by how articulate you are, and your extreme grasp of the entirety of the situation. Like I'll be honest with you, I didn't expect you to, based on those like trans experiment videos, to be very intelligent, but you're really quite intelligent. And I wonder, like, I don't know, did you grow up like in some kind of like a Jewish community where you were constantly debating? Did you grow up like as a debate kid? What, like, I want to know, and you can go if you want to go, but I'm really curious to know about like what you were like when you were younger.
Well, we're ethnic and cultural Jews. So my grandma was born in Jerusalem. And so we weren't religious Jews because my mother converted to Christianity prior to us being born when she met my dad, and my dad's a Christian. So we're these cultural and ethnic Jews, but religious Christians. And so we would celebrate Hanukkah with my grandparents and things like that on my mother's side. But we also had this Christian upbringing that was instilled in us, and with that, a moral framework. And also, as I mentioned before, we didn't go to these crummy, horrible public schools where we had to, celebrate pride and read books on why Johnny wants to change his gender. We were reading Charles Dickens, we were reading, Huckleberry Finn. And so I think I just grew up kind of as a nerd, reading a lot and writing a lot and being homeschooled and using my imagination. And I think I just had kind of I just had common sense. And I wish a lot more people had common sense. I feel like it's kind of missing now, but I don't think I have anything special. I refuse to be brainwashed. I know it's a cult. I can tell it's a cult. And I just refuse to let it suck me in. And I think if other people do that, then they'll also appear smart. But I don't think there's anything particularly smart about me. I just always try to rely on my gut and my common sense.
Wow, I think that's a good message for everybody. I think it's a good message, especially for young people, because we have a very underdeveloped sense of intuition. It's something that you have to develop. And when you grow up in a culture that is at every single turn telling you to deny your basic intuition, it'll meddle with your development in a way that is really quite catastrophic. Like, it doesn't really matter exactly which woke belief you latch onto, but especially if you latch onto the woke gender beliefs, then it has the potential of not only colluding with these like sort of natural or sort of expected teenage self-harm fantasies that a lot of teenagers, especially teenage girls, have, but it has this way of kind of like meddling with your development psychologically and also potentially physically if you pursue it through physical or biomedical interventions. And so it's your backstory is really fascinating, and I hope that more people, will listen to you and will take you seriously instead of just hurling allegations at you like, oh, he's a grifter, because that just, to me, like I see it even a lot on the gender critical side, and it's like, well, and I've been called a grifter myself, and when I think about a grifter, I looked up the term online, and from my research, it seems like a grifter is somebody who is kind of spouting something that is disingenuous, that they don't actually believe. So if anything, your trans experiment was a quote unquote grift, but this, because you didn't genuinely believe that you were really a woman or whatever. So like in my mind, I think people need to actually take you seriously because you have a good grasp of the concept. And I really hope that people do start to take you seriously on this.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'd like to just continue the conversation. When I was growing up, it was all about critical thinking, open dialogue, civic debate. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, where he, expounds on the virtues of open discussions, because that's where the truth comes out. The truth really shines when it's put to the test. You don't need to censor people for the truth to come out. The truth will always come out based on the merit of the argument. So the best thing we can do for the truth to come out is to just have open dialogue. Well, it's very interesting that is the opposite of what the woke mob wants. The woke mob does not want a dialogue. They don't want you to question things. They don't want open discussion, and they will censor you, and that is because they know that the truth will come out if it's subject to scrutiny, into debate, into civil conversations, and so they don't want that. And so that we're on the side of truth because we want open discussion, and they're on the side of being disingenuous and being liars because they don't want open discussion. So everyone should be very reticent and leery of people who are not okay with open dialogue and discussion. And I want to break that mold and go back to how it was 20 years ago, where we agree to disagree and we have these conversations and we have these dialectics. And I think this one has been a productive one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Josh. I can't wait to see what's in store for you in the future, and I really wish you the best on your media tour. I mean, I just think that the social experiment that you ran was incredibly sort of it was insightful, and I think that I hope that maybe it's a naive hope because I'm still 25 but I do have this naive hope that there may be like one or two people who are kind of on the fence about, whether or not it's advantageous or a good idea for them or for society to buy into this trans belief system. They might be saying, I don't know this, because I encounter these people a lot, the ones who are sort of on the fence about whether or not they should believe like certain premises. They might reject other premises of this ideology. Like they might say, yeah, obviously this is bad for kids because it is irreversible, but if you're 18, you're legally an adult, go for it. And it's like, wait, but if it's bad for kids, then and an 18-year-old was just yesterday a child.
Right.
Like, and there's no evidence that any of this is a good idea for anybody, or they'll say like, oh, some men who pass as women, they should be able to go into the women's restroom. And it's like, but then the more research you do into sort of like the psychology of autogynephilia, you have some autogynephiles who really don't even remotely pass as women, and they seem to be totally unaware of that because of the echo chamber they're in. And so it's like, also when we have to legislate something, laws, you can't legislate, like you can't effectively legislate exceptions. You have to legislate rules, and then like other external courts, like maybe the Supreme Court, or like some kind of local measure may be used to mitigate the exception. But in this case, what ended up happening is that basically you had these very rare cases of these men who wanted, sex changes, and their legal documents had to be changed in order for them to be able to move from one country to the next to complete these procedures, especially after they'd already started presenting as women. And we're talking about the 1950s. So it's like, I think there's a lot that we still haven't covered, and that hasn't gotten yet into the culture war. But I guess the very last question I'll ask you is, what is one aspect of this entire crisis of gender ideology that you feel like isn't being discussed in the culture war that you think is like really, really pressing to discuss? And then I'll let you go, I promise.
Oh, wow. That's a tough one. I mean, I think Republicans are doing a good job of talking about it. The most extreme cases where you have a triple convicted murderer bragging about how he's going to get a taxpayer funded gender reassignment surgery, that needs to be talked about. His name's John Jacobson Jr., and he threw a retired couple off of a yacht and killed somebody else in Mexico. I think we just need to have some kind of a conversation, because there is no window of conversation. The media isn't asking Kamala Harris any questions that relate to this, because they know most of Americans would disagree with her stance and policy position on it. So I just think we need to have a very basic conversation about, is this legitimate? Is it doing harm to the LGBT community? Is everyone really a monolith and in on this and totally okay with it? Or maybe should we, let other people voice their opinion that are within the community, like Buck Angel? And so I think we just need to have a very basic dialogue about, hey, let's talk about bio men living with our daughters at college and playing on their sports teams with them, and taking away their scholarship, and taking away 980 medals last year, as that report was just published the other day. These are conversations we need to have. So I think just a basic conversation would be a start. If you were to get into a very nuanced, very niche part of this whole postmodern gender ideology, I would say, whether the fact that something being gender dysphoria ipso facto means it must qualify as trans. That seems like the conclusion to me. They're just telling us, oh, if you have gender dysphoria, then you're trans. That needs to be questioned more. Does it? And who's the arbiter of that? And so I think more discussions around GD, more discussions around autogynephilia need to be had, instead of just these extreme cases of these viral videos that we see on the internet. I think those are just a couple things that we could talk about.
Wow. Thank you. I think you summarized the issue very well. I know you're very busy, and I'll let you go, but Josh, I really appreciate the time. This was only supposed to be like a 25-minute interview. Yeah. And then it was like just two Jewish nerds like going at it back and forth.
It really was. Well, thank you for having me. I had a fantastic time, and I'd love to continue another discussion at another time as well.
Absolutely. That would be awesome. Well, I hope you have a good day. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. And Josh, thank you so much for your time. And it'll be really interesting to see how this story continues to play out in the media. I'm really excited about it.
It will, and whoever's watching can follow me on Twitter at Josh_Seiter, and Instagram with all of the videos that are there at Josh Seiter Official. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye. Everybody.